Hey guys, my name is Liam for GoneJeepin.com. I'm here with my friend Brandon, and he has a Jeep to show us that is absolutely magnificent. What do we have here today?
We got a 1943 Willys MB military Jeep, straight out of World War II. So excited to show you guys some of the quirks and the features on it today.
All right, let's jump right in. All right, why don't we start from the front bumper to the rear bumper. We're going to cover some of the basics of this Jeep, and then we're going to get into some of the more fun, quirky details that come along with a vehicle of this age. This guy's got full floating axles. What's the deal with that? Why would they do something like that?
Yeah, and I guess the military, they specified the full floating axles just from a durability standpoint, just to make sure they weren't going to have any problems out in the field. So up front you've got a Dana 25 full float, and then in the back you've got a Dana 23-2 full float.
This would be more original, right? The NDTs?
Yep, it's a 600 by 16 non-directional tire, and then it's mounted on what's called a combat wheel. It's actually a two-piece rim, and it's held together with these carriage bolts that you see along the circumference of the wheel.
And what do the carriage bolts do?
It actually physically holds the two halves of the wheel together.
Wow. Okay.
It's a little dangerous, but that's how it was designed. It was designed that way, kind of a run flat. So if you did get a flat, like you'd still be able to drive on it.
Okay, that's very interesting. And then the NDT, you said it stands for non-directional, so we don't know if you're coming or going, right?
That's the legend, but I think it was more just so it made it really easy. If you did have a flat and you needed to swap out to the spare, you could just mount it in whatever position. You didn't have to worry about the direction of the tire.
All right. Well, hopefully we're still in frame down here.
Just for fun.
You never know. All right, so we're working our way back. We're going to come back to some of the lettering on here because this S means something very special, but we're coming back to that, so stay tuned. All right, working our way back here, you've got your passenger seat. We got one of these things. What's this doing here?
We got an eyelet. So there's actually there are no doors on this vehicle, but you do have a safety strap. And so, take it out here. And the safety strap just clips just right here, and that's essentially your door. That's how you make sure your passengers don't fall out. Because obviously the driver, you've got a nice steering wheel to grab onto and you're making a tight turn or going around a corner, but your passenger has nothing. So safety of the passenger in mind.
So a lot of the newer Jeeps, and especially like the Wrangler itself, would have a handle up here. And I'm not seeing anything for the passenger to hold on to. So I bet that strap was probably what they're holding on to for dear life as they're going over their ruts and whatnot, saving the day. All right, very cool. So we're looking here, I'm seeing the exhaust right here. Is this where it ends?
Yeah, this is literally the muffler right here. And yeah, it just dumps it out just in front of this rear tire.
Okay, so not worried about fumes or anything like that, apparently.
No. Because 1940s automotive engineering. They didn't worry about that stuff.
What do we have going on back here? What's unique about any of this?
So these are actually the top bows. So every MB came from the factory with a canvas top, and the top bows actually support that top. When the top isn't being used, they actually stow really neatly on the back of the body. And then when you want to use them, you basically just kind of slide out of these pockets, and this end actually comes down into this pocket, and then it sits up like this, and then this part kind of hinges forward, and that supports the canvas.
Wow. All right, so we're gonna work to the back of the vehicle, and then like I said, we're gonna dive in a little bit closer to some of the nooks and crannies of this Jeep. But I've always wondered, because I've seen it on all the Jeeps, the toy Jeeps, whatever, we've got a handle back here. What on earth are they doing with a handle on the corner of this vehicle?
Yeah, it's funny. We talked about how there's no grab handle on the dash for a passenger to grab onto, but yet we've got 4 grab handles on the exterior of the vehicle. And, the thought here is not that a bunch of guys are going to get on this thing and lift it up if it gets stuck. It does weigh 2,300 pounds, but it does give a spot. If it does get stuck, it does have open differentials front and rear, so getting stuck is a realistic thing that could happen.
Very much so.
But it provides something, for some guys to get on here and rock it and try to get it unstuck if it does get stuck in some deep mud.
All right, so forgive me for just a moment. As you're doing that, I'm picturing, I'm a young man in World War II, and we got nothing better to do. We got a lot of mud in front of us. I'm picturing this is like a wakeboarding handle. Like you're gonna sit here and just really ride your feet on the mud. But I don't know, maybe your grandpa did that and you can send us a photo. That'd be really great. All right, let's take a look at the interior of this. All of these old Jeeps come with a stamp right on the dash. What do we have going on here?
So we've actually got a nice little glove box right here. But probably the coolest feature of the glove box is you'll notice the 3 data plates on it. And actually the middle one is stamped with the date of delivery, which is actually when it was accepted by the United States Army after they did their inspection. Not actually the date it was built, but probably a few days after. So this was actually delivered to the United States Army on September 17th, 1943. So kind of cool. A lot of people recognize this as the birthday of an MB or a World War II Jeep.
All right.
Another cool feature, you actually notice on the side, you notice these 4 bolts. And what do those bolts hold? Well, under the front passenger seat, we've actually got what's called a radio junction box. And that's this guy right here. And what happens is 6-volt power comes up from the battery. It goes under the front floor, up through this metal conduit, and then into this box. And so if in the field, whatever unit had this Jeep wanted to install a radio, it made it very easy for radio installation. They could just tap right into this box. It already had 6-volt power, and they could get the power to run the radio. So these were added to all Jeeps starting sometime in 1943.
And you were telling me that they can tap into that box and then they can run it kind of really anywhere in the back for passengers to run the radio. And
yep, they
like
typically would. The radio would typically be mounted in the back behind the driver's seat. So they'd have to, run the cable up along the floor, but definitely makes it a little bit easier for that job.
Very cool.
And then in the back too, we've actually got these Toolbox Lockers. You'll notice them on either side built into the rear wheel wells. So it's actually a great use of dead space. And then inside you've got plenty of room for, storing a jack or a lug nut wrench or, because really these Jeeps, when they were built, when they were provided to the military, they came with a huge assortment of spare parts and tools. And these Toolbox Lockers provided a ton of room for storing all of that stuff and making sure it didn't get lost. Another cool feature is actually behind the rear seat. You notice this long metal rod. That's actually the hand crank. Every single MB was provided factory with a hand crank, just in case you needed to start it and your starter had gone out or your battery was dead. You could start it by hand manually.
And that hand crank, how does that attach to the engine so you can actually use it?
Yeah, so let's go to the front, and you'll notice in the front bumper, there's actually this hole. So you take that hand crank and you stick it through this hole, and then it'll actually engage a nut on the crankshaft. And then you just, once you've got it engaged, then you just pull up on it, give it a nice jerk upward, and ideally the engine should start. And then in the back, of course, you've got your spare tire, you've got your jerry can, pintle hook. You notice on the back too, you've got reflectors as well as blackout tail lamps. On the other side, this is your normal tail lamp and stop lamp. And then this here is actually a socket for plugging in electrical for a trailer. So this was standard on every single MB. I think this was added sometime in 1942. It's interesting just how many changes the MB went through during its course of production from 1941 until production ended in 1945. Lots and lots of little changes, like the addition of that trailer socket. Of course, you've got the iconic shovel and axe that everybody loves to see on the side of a World War II Jeep. Probably another interesting, quirky feature of the MBs is the ignition switch is actually just a toggle switch. It's not a key. So the early MBs, they actually had a key, a lock cylinder. So when you turn that, it would send power to the coil, so then you could start the vehicle. But obviously the military, they realized that in a combat situation, having a key wasn't ideal, because then you had to figure out who had the key, and it caused problems if you needed to start the vehicle and get moving very quickly. So they just switched to a simple toggle switch that eliminated a key. So really anyone could hop in this and get it started and drive away without needing a key.
Do you still have it as a toggle switch today, or do you have a key for this?
I do not have a key for it, because it is, I mean, yeah, there is no key, but it's also, the startup procedure isn't something that a lot of people would be familiar with, because it is very foreign to most drivers, because all this does, like I said, is send power to the coil. It doesn't actually start the vehicle. And then you've got a separate floor-mounted starter switch underneath the dash that then you have to depress with your foot to actually start the engine.
Yeah, so that's a pretty good theft deterrent right there.
That's what I figure. So the only problem is if you've got it parked somewhere and somebody just, it's like, oh, hey, what does this do? And they just flip it, and then it's sitting like that for a couple hours, it could burn out the coil. That's the only downside.
All right, we're on the driver's side of the Jeep now, and there's a lot of content on this side of the Jeep that we just need to talk about. We've already hit on a couple of them, but one thing I noticed right away, I'm kind of proud of myself for noticing this, but the gas tank isn't normal to what I'd expect. I was expecting more of like the CJ gas tank where it's just under the seat, but we got something else going on down here. What's all this?
So we actually have a sump. So the government specified that the military Jeep had a 15-gallon tank, and so they could easily fit 10 gallons above the floor underneath the driver's seat, but to get that extra 5 gallons, they actually had to put the rest of the tank below the plane of the floor. And so that's why you've got this sump hanging down. This is actually the fuel tank. You know, kind of susceptible to banging it, you know, against a rock or something in a true off-road situation. It's a little vulnerable, but that's what they did. Another interesting thing about the fuel tank is there's a lot going on here. There's not really a good spot to have an external fuel fill. What you do is you just lift up on this driver's seat bottom cushion, and then you've got your cap right here. And then stick your nozzle down in there, and that's how you get fuel into the tank.
Something I absolutely love about this is that cap is massive. That's not your normal fuel cap size.
Well, it's also got this extension that comes up.
Whoa.
And the idea there is if you need to refill this with using a jerry can, it makes it very easy when you got this massive target to hit, as opposed to having a little tiny cap.
And it's something you don't think about usually, but that is very necessary if you've ever run out of gas on the side of the road and had to fill with even just like a modern day gas can. It's not easy.
It's hard.
It's really not great.
But it'd be easy on this.
Very cool. All right, there's one last thing on the interior of this that I've just got to ask about. I'm seeing these little boxes back here, and I originally thought this was some sort of, you know, fixturing for the rear seat, but you're telling me this is something completely different.
Yeah, it really doesn't serve any functional purpose other than be a cover. Actually, if you were to remove this cover, you would actually see the upper rear shock mounts. You know, instead of kind of angling the shock forward when they were designing the suspension, they wanted to make sure that shock was completely vertical. And as a result of that, and based on where they wanted the floor height, they actually just had to create these stamped steel covers that got welded to the floor right over those shock mounts.
Okay, wow. That's not what I expected at all. So here, blow me away one more time. What are these doing here?
These are actually rear seat footrests for passengers in the rear seat. Not really sure why they thought these were necessary, but the idea is if you got a couple guys sitting in the back seat, they can rest their feet on these footrests. It's kind of like those fancy footrests on those big tour buses that you get on sometimes.
So I guess we could say this is one of the few luxury features on this vehicle. I guess the alternative would be to put your feet up here and then up there on the driver. So maybe that was kind of the rationale, was keeping the driver from turning this car around.
Yeah.
Because you're putting your feet on them. So what are we looking at down here? What's this circle plate?
So this is actually the master cylinder access cover. So if you were to take this off, it gives you a clear shot at the master cylinder, so you can unscrew the top and you can check the fluid level and add more brake fluid if you need to.
All right, and then you got a cylinder of sorts right here. What's going on there?
This, believe it or not, is actually a fire extinguisher. So these MBs, they were equipped from the factory with a mount for a fire extinguisher, an old school fire extinguisher. And so that's actually what the cylinder is, mounted right underneath the dash.
All right, so the driver sitting on top of the gas tank is probably the first person to want to put out the fire.
Exactly, so it makes sense. He's got easy access to the extinguisher.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, well, let's get into the engine bay. All right, first I want to start really simple. Not all of these components look like modern day car parts. So if you can just show us really quick, what are we looking at? What are these different components?
Yeah, so let's start over here. This is actually the fuel filter. This is the air cleaner. It's an oil bath air cleaner. So there's actually oil at the bottom of this air cleaner. And so the dirty air, it gets passed over the oil, and then any dirt, any particles in the air stick to that oil before it goes, and then the clean air then goes into the engine. This is the oil filter canister right here. This is the voltage regulator, massive beefy voltage regulator, cast aluminum. Under here, we've got the rest of the electrical components. We got the generator, once again another massive part, the starter motor, the distributor, and then over here is the Carter WO carburetor.
Now, something I've been seeing on a lot of these old engines is you've got the carburetor being here, you got the exhaust on the same side, and they all just kind of intertwine, which, I mean, a lot of like the modern understanding of car parts is let's keep the air charge as cold as possible and the exhaust away from it. And that's not what's happening here. They look like they're attached to each other.
They are attached, and there's actually, you'll notice this little cast iron counterweight. This is called a heat riser. There's actually a valving inside the exhaust manifold, and there's actually a channel cast into the intake around where the intake air goes. So on a cold start, exhaust gases, before it goes out through the muffler, actually gets routed through the intake just to try to heat things up and warm up the air, just to help get the engine started and keep it running on a really cold day. And then once it warms up, this little cast iron counterweight, it moves up, and that actually closes off that valve, so then the exhaust gases are just dumping straight out the muffler as opposed to circulating around the intake.
Wow, very cool. And I think a lot of that has to do with it being a carbureted vehicle. Like, we had a lot more issues in the past with cold start than we do today with the fuel injection, computer controlled, all of that fun.
Yep.
Very cool. And then this would be your fuel pump?
Yep, this is the fuel pump, and it's actually got a little hand primer lever on it. Once again, just to help with a really cold start on a cold morning, you can actually kind of pump up a little bit of gas into the carburetor, and that'll help get the engine started.
Oh, wow. Alrighty, well, let's talk about some of the more unique things in here. Okay, so I mentioned it at the beginning of the video, and I did one of those telltale teasers saying, hey, stick around until the end of the video. I pointed out there's an S on the side of this Jeep. Why is there an S on the side of this Jeep?
So the S means that the vehicle has been suppressed, so it doesn't create a lot of electrical interference that could interfere with a shortwave radio. I guess the shortwave radios that the military was using at the time, they were very susceptible to being interfered with electrical noise produced by a running vehicle. And so the military wanted to prevent that. So you'll notice there are ground straps all over this engine bay. You got ground straps between the hood and the body, the speedometer cable, the choke cable, literally everything has a ground strap going to it. And that was all done just to prevent all that electrical noise that could interfere with a shortwave radio, whether that radio was in the Jeep itself or in a vehicle parked 50 yards away. So when the vehicle was built at the factory, they would actually roll this vehicle into a giant metal cage. So in the cage was just the vehicle and then a shortwave radio. And then they would start the vehicle, run the Jeep, and make sure that the radio had no interference. And if there was no interference, the vehicle would pass the test, and then that coveted S for suppressed could be stenciled on the cowl.
Wow. How cool is that?
One other interesting feature, you'll notice this tensioning arm for the generator is actually spring loaded. So you can actually pull up on this arm and you can actually remove all of the tension out of the fan belt. And what's the benefit of doing that? Well, let's say you need to ford a river or some kind of body of water. When you're fording that stream, this fan blade is actually going to splash water all over this ignition, which is not waterproof. So if you remove the tension in the fan belt, the fan blade will not be spinning as you're going through that water. You'll save the ignition, the vehicle won't stop. You get out of the water, and then you simply just push this arm back down and retension the fan belt.
Alrighty. So now there's a couple other things in here that you had told me about. One is this oil canister. I don't have this on my Jeep. Well, why would this Jeep have an oil canister under the hood?
So the military, they want to make sure that the soldiers had every tool available that was needed to maintain the Jeep, so that the soldiers had no excuse for a poorly maintained vehicle. So they had equipped as standard an oil can mount underneath the hood. The oil can itself then was included as part of the spare parts and toolkit. And then this could be used for lubricating the horn, the generator, the starter, the distributor, all the electrical components. And then starting in 1944, they actually added a grease gun mount, if you can believe that, underneath the hood, right on that side. In addition to that, they also had a holder for a lubrication chart, so that there was no excuse for a ungreased chassis, because there are like 30 or 40 grease fittings on the underside of this vehicle. And just, yeah, everything that the soldier needed to grease the chassis.
Wow. So now there's one other thing I see in here, and it's probably something that you might not notice, but it's one of my favorite parts on this Jeep you were showing me earlier. These headlights seem to be mounted in a very unconventional way. Why are they like that?
So they're actually mounted on a hinge. And let's say you've got ignition problems and it's the middle of the night, it's dark, you don't have a flashlight. How are you gonna see what's wrong with the engine? Well, the headlamps are the answer. So there's a wing nut on either side. You unscrew that wing nut, and then the whole headlamp pivots. You can actually loosen the headlamp itself, the bucket, and you can actually swivel it, point it at the engine, and use it like a trouble lamp.
Wow, and both headlights do that.
Yep.
That is really, really cool. And what an elegant solution to something. They're not adding another light. They're not adding any extra, well, they're adding some complexity, I suppose, but no extra electronics, none of that. Yet you have the ability to work on the vehicle in the middle of the night, which I'm sure was really important, especially in wartime. Very cool. All right, so there's one last thing that I've seen on military vehicles in Jeeps, and although I've read what they are, I don't understand what they do. And it's these right here. What on earth is this little lamp doing right here? And then if you look at it, there's no, seemingly anyway, no light bulb. So what is the point of this thing?
So this is called the blackout driving light. So it's part of the blackout lighting system. So the rationale behind the blackout lighting system is if you're driving in a convoy at night, you can't have your headlamps on because it's gonna put out a puddle of light on the road. And if you've got an enemy plane flying over, it'll make it very easy for them to pick out the convoy from the air. So the blackout lights, you've got these two little lights in the grill beneath the headlamps, and these actually just put out a tiny amount of light. So when you're in the convoy, the guy in front of you, he can look behind, he can see these little lights and know, yep, this guy's still behind me. And then same on the back, you've got blackout tail lamps. Once again, puts out a little amount of light, and then the person behind you in the convoy can see you, know they're not getting too close, and make sure that they're still keeping up with you. Then you've got the blackout driving lamp. And this is the point of it. It's supposed to put a little puddle of light on the ground, very small, very dim, just enough for you to kind of see if there's anything in the road, any obstacle, anything in front of you. I've tried using it once before, and quite honestly, it puts out so little light, it's almost completely useless. But there's like a tiny little slit underneath this hood for the light to come out, and then the hood kind of directs it down in front of the tire. But it's barely effective at all, at least based on my personal experience.
All right, guys, we're wrapping this up. This has been an absolute pleasure looking at this Jeep, and you did a fantastic job on restoring it. Now, you did all of this work yourself, correct?
Yeah, pretty much all of it. So I've wanted a World War II Jeep ever since I was like 5 years old. I rode in one at an air show, and I've wanted one ever since. And it's always been on my bucket list to get one. So about 2 years ago, I had the opportunity to purchase this Jeep, which I did. I purchased it in Virginia, trailered it back here to Michigan. And I kind of drove it around that first summer and noticed a ton of problems with it. The transmission would slip out of second gear. It leaked a ton of gear oil from the transfer case and the transmission. And there was a ton of Bondo in the body and just lots of other problems. So I ended up tearing the entire thing apart down to the chassis, and then did a body off restoration on it last winter, but tried to keep it very true to how it would have looked coming off the assembly line at Willys Overland in Toledo, Ohio in September 1943, right down to the blue drab hood numbers. Typically you see a military Jeep and the hood numbers are white. When it came from the factory, these hood numbers are actually blue. I think it was like late 1944, early 1945, Willys did switch to painting the hood numbers white. But this vehicle would have come with the blue drab. And the thought process behind it is, if you're far enough away, the blue drab kind of blends into the olive drab paint. So if there were photos of vehicles or of a vehicle buildup that got in enemy hands, they wouldn't be able to really read the hood registration numbers and pinpoint units and that sort of thing. And also kind of added to the whole camouflage as well. But what's interesting about the hood numbers on this vehicle, it's 203-56919, which is an estimated, it fits within the estimated range of the hood number this vehicle would have come with from the factory. It's not the actual number that it came from the factory with, but it fits within the estimated range. And the last four digits, 6919, that has special meaning. That stands for June 9th, 2019, which is actually the first day I took this out for a drive after doing the restoration on it. So
wow.
So not only does it fit within the range of the number it would have actually had from the factory, but there's actually some personal significance to me.
So you took this vehicle and you restored it as accurately as you possibly could to make it something that is not necessarily you. And then when you put these numbers on, you have a little hidden gem of sorts that is 100% pointing to you and your experience with this Jeep. So there's no doubt in your mind that this is your Jeep and not just another one that someone else restored.
Yep, exactly.
That's really cool. Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. We've got more videos. He's actually got another Jeep that we're going to look at, so stay tuned for that. And I never know what to say at the end of videos. So, all right, hey guys, thank you.
Thanks,
Goodbye.
We're gone Jeeping. So be sure
to like,
share,
and subscribe.
And if you want to be notified, make sure you ring that bell.